Welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takeishi, a board-certified music therapist. Join me each week as a new guest from across the fine and creative arts spheres shares struggles, triumphs, laughs, words of wisdom, and more in authentic, thought-provoking, and inspiring interviews. Hello, and welcome to Creative Piecemeal. Today, I am with award-winning journalist, correspondent, and spirituality author, Judith Valente. She is launching a book, The Italian Soul, How to Savor the Full Joys of Life, from Hampton Roads Publishing and Red Wheel Wiser, which offers insights into what we can learn from Italians about living more mindfully, meaningfully, and joyfully. Judith Valente has won numerous awards for her work as a former correspondent for PBS, 2 NPR stations, The Wall Street Journal, and is the author of several spirituality titles. Her most recent books also include How to Live, The Art of Pausing, and How to Be. And she's also published 2 poetry collections and is a sought-after retreat guide who leads the annual Benedictine Footprints retreat pilgrimage to lesser-known parts of Italy. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on to talk about your book, to talk about mindfulness, and wherever our conversation travels.
Thank you, Tammy. It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you. So first question out of the gate, what sparked you to write your newest book, The Italian Soul, but also if you could tell listeners who may not be familiar with your work a little bit about your other books as well.
Yeah, well, so I've been a spirituality author for several years now, about 7 years now. About 7 years ago, I took early retirement from full-time journalism, and I began writing books for people like me who are workaholics and overachievers. And I became very interested in the contemplative way of living. What do I mean by that? Well, what's a contemplative attitude? It's an attitude that sees the poetic and the sacred in the ordinary events of daily life. And so I began visiting a number of monasteries to learn about the contemplative life, because who are more contemplative than people who live in monasteries? And then I began to spend long periods of time in Italy after my early retirement. And I began to see that the contemplative life comes naturally to Italians. They live it naturally. They don't have to be in a monastery. And so I decided I wanted to know what was their secret and what were some of the practices that they do, some of the ways they look at life that we can incorporate into our busy, hectic, overwhelming American life. And that was kind of the genesis of it.
Excellent. What is something that you do when you first approach anything that you've written?
What I do when I first approach anything I've written? Well, I think a lot about it. I think a lot about, what would be interesting to other people? What would be interesting to somebody like my mother, for example, who never had the opportunity to even graduate from high school? I'm 100% Italian American, by the way. So I think about, what would be meaningful, not just to me, but to all kinds of people of many different educational levels and backgrounds. And I think a lot before I write. So when I sit down to write, it comes very quickly and comes very easily to me to write.
Excellent.
Because I've done that spade work, that marinade before I sit down to write.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely marinate a little bit. I mean, I like to write poetry, songs, and prose, but I don't write nonfiction or anything of that nature, or self-help, or, that's not my forte, but I definitely take a little bit of time to marinate too. What is one of your favorite parts of marinating in that process before you go?
Well, I do a lot of reading too. I mean, I see what else is out there. For example, what were the other books about Italy? So I read a ton of books in Italy so that my book would offer something new, maybe, and a slightly different perspective than what's already out there. So I do a fair amount of research, but that also comes from my journalism days, where you take in a great deal of information, you synthesize a great deal of information, and then you try to let that flow out of you into some sort of a whole, of some sort of a complete piece of writing that will be meaningful to other people.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to reflect back a little bit on your journalism days. What is something that you learned early on that really stuck with you?
Well, a couple of things. We used to say, when in doubt, leave it out. Don't put anything in your story that you're not 100% sure of. Also, going through your copy and looking for what we used to call, I don't know if they still call it this in journalism school, but wasted words. What are the words that you can take out? When I began writing poetry, I have an MFA in creative writing, not in journalism. And so my focus in my master's degree was poetry. And one of my poetry teachers, Marie Howe, used to say, kill the little babies. If it's really not adding anything to the poem, but you just love that word, you're in love with that word, or you're in love with that phrase, kill that little baby. So those are a couple of things that I took from my journalism days. And also, when I worked for the Wall Street Journal, the motto was to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And that was sort of a motto that guided my whole journalism career, that I wanted to be of service to people. And when I started writing spirituality books, I still wanted to be of service to people and let them in on what was meaningful what became meaningful in my life. What did I find that became meaningful, that helped me perhaps become a little bit better person than I was the day before?
That's wonderful. So the creative process, I love that you mentioned that you studied poetry. I love poetry. So before we get, I so many questions I want to ask you. But first, poetry. Who is one of your favorite poets, whether living or already passed on?
Okay, well, I'll start with the passed on. Of course, Mary Oliver comes to mind. She was a beautiful writer and a very spiritual person. I had the opportunity to meet her many times. She gave me a poetry award. She chose me for a poetry award. So I, bowed down to her for that. And Elizabeth Bishop. Now, Elizabeth Bishop, many people don't know her. She died in 1979, but she was a very, very exacting poet. There's not one wasted word in any of Elizabeth Bishop's poems. And I tell people, you want to read a perfectly crafted poem, read Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, which begins, "The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost. Their loss is no disaster." So it's the rhyme in it, the form that she uses is perfect. Now, poets I just absolutely love who are living, Marie Howe. She was my first poetry mentor. Also, James Cruz. If anybody's on Instagram, James publishes a poem just about every day. I don't know how he comes up with these beautiful poems every day, because for me, it's difficult to write one good poem. He writes a good poem 365 days of the year. And Angela Alamo O'Donnell is another of my favorite poets. She teaches at Fordham University, and she writes a lot in the sonnet form. And you don't see that. You don't see modern or contemporary, I should say, poets writing very much in form. And she does a beautiful job. It's very subtle. You don't even know that it's a sonnet because it's so subtle, but her poems are very, very beautiful.
Nice. And how did studying the MFA inform not only your journalism career, but also your book writing?
Absolutely. Studying poetry, focusing on poetry for my master's really made me a much better writer. I mean, journalism makes you a very good writer. It teaches you how to write for other people, not for yourself, but other people. But then poetry takes it to another level. It forces you to really look for that word that might be much more interesting and intriguing to use. And often I'll go through my copy and I'll look at the nouns and I'll say, okay, what noun there is too easy? What noun would be much more interesting and fascinating there? And I go through the verbs and I say, what verb would be more intriguing to have here or more descriptive to have here? So I know that poetry, the study of poetry and the reading of poetry, has made me a much better writer, much better journalist even.
I would agree. Studying poetry is just, plus it's just so soul filling, it And it's like little snippets of a mood or an ambiance or something, you know?
I like how you put that, soul filling. I would totally agree.
So, creative process. Obviously, the creative process is different depending on what your output is, what your intention is. But what is one of your least favorite parts, and what is one of your favorite parts about the process?
Well, editing is always a little hard to take. And I've been very fortunate on my books to always have very good editors, and they ask good questions. I've also had editors who just, will ask you an off the wall question just to show that they're there, that they're doing something. And it takes up your time to have to answer some question out of left field from some editor. But then there are editors who, are really there to respect your work and to try to make it better. And that's a joyful part of the editing process. I guess the hardest part is maybe getting that first page done. Looking at that blank page. And the only remedy for that is to start to write. Whether it's good or not. I mean, that's a key. That's a key to writing, and writing well, is that you just have to be courageous enough to start and realize that first draft or that first effort is not going to be picture perfect, and that you'll go back to it. You'll go back to it and improve it. E.B. White said, the art of writing is applying the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. And I often think about that, like when I'm afraid to sit down and start a big project, like to write a book, that's running a marathon. Writing an article for the Wall Street Journal or reporting a segment for PBS TV, that's a sprint. But to write a book it's really a monumental thing that you're taking on. I mean, you have to have a lot of stamina to write a book. And so it all starts with applying the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair and putting the fingers on the keyboard and start moving those fingers and typing letters.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Definitely, because you never know what inspiration will happen, what will jump out, what's been maybe brewing under the surface of your consciousness in terms of creativity, unless you just try. It's almost like going on a road trip and thinking like, well, let's just see how far this gas tank gets you.
Right, exactly. That's a very good way of putting it.
Getting back to your latest book, The Italian Soul, descriptions include, having a deep appreciation for quality and aesthetics, valuing slowness and savoring the little moments of life. What is a little moment in your life that really brings you inspiration, especially on a, maybe a less than stellar day?
Well, you're asking tough questions there, Tammy. Well, I try to take little pauses in my day and just look out the window and see what the squirrels are doing. And if it's summer, if it's August, I'll see what the hummingbirds are doing. We have a lot of hummingbirds come around here where I live in central Illinois. And this time of year, my pauses are to try to see the little minuscule changes in the trees every day, for example, and the plants coming up and the little flowers that are starting to come up with what we call the spring ephemerals, because they are ephemeral. They just last a short time. That's why they're so precious. So those are some of the small moments that I savor in my day. And to tell you the truth, I savor the end of the day, the end of my work day. My husband has his office upstairs. I have my office downstairs, and we come together. We usually have lunch together, and we usually watch the news hour together on PBS. And that, I just love that. I love that there's somebody that I can come home to, even though we live in the same house, that I can come home to at the end of the day. Because I married later in life. I was a career woman, and that's very precious to me, to have someone to eat with, to watch the news hour with every night.
Yeah. And that's so special, having a life that you love and then another person adding to that with their presence, elevating it.
And it's very Italian, because Italians really reverence the dinner table, reverence the meal table. I had a lot of married friends who were my age, and they had children. And it amazed me. Nobody ever sat down and ate together, because one kid had soccer, another kid had ballet. And so, they weren't eating together. They weren't eating the same things. They weren't eating at the same times. And everybody sits down at the same time in Italy, and the Sunday meal with family is still very sacred. I love that. I love that about Italy. And what's funny, Tammy, is you talk about family. Well, often the ex husband of somebody's daughter will still be invited for Sunday dinner. I mean, even the divorcees will still be welcome at the family table. And that whole emphasis on friendship. When I'm in Italy, I can walk out of my apartment that I might be renting and walk into the street and see a minimum of 3 people that I know walking around the town. Sometimes here in the States, I have very, very good friends, but they're very busy all the time. And I feel like I'm in this New Yorker cartoon where you see the cartoon is the guy is on the phone, right? And he's looking at his date book and he says to the person on the other end of the line, well, how about never? No, excuse me. No, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? And I feel like saying that to my friends sometimes is, well, if you can't do it this week or this month or next month, how about never? Is never good for you? Because people, are so busy in the States. And they're going places all the time.
Yeah. And you bring up such a good point about, work-life balance, life balance, whatever you're trying to balance and taking the time to slow down and reflect so that you can give all of yourself to everything that you want to, Yeah.
I grew up in the New York area and you know how it is. There's hot dog stands and there's, salted pretzel stands. And now there's these food trucks and people eat standing up in the street on the go. And, they might grab a bagel on the go and eat it on their way to work. I mean, I grew up in that atmosphere. That would never do in Italy. If you can't spare an hour or 2 hours to sit down and have a meal, they just won't have it any other way. And I think we've lost a lot of that in our country. And I'm hoping my book will help people to focus on that a little bit more, that kind of thing a little bit more, the slowing down, to appreciate life and to appreciate the people that are around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important. It adds to the quality of life because in the end, isn't that all we really have is thinking like, what about the quality of life? How much did we help people? How much did we make a positive impact?
You're bringing up such a good point, Tammy. I always think of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, and his wife told an anecdote on a documentary about him that when he was dying of cancer, he asked her, do you think that I'll be a goat or a sheep? Because there's this gospel passage about people will be separated like the goats and the sheep by how much service they gave. And how much they served other people in this life. Jesus tells this parable to his disciples. And so I often think if Mr. Rogers wondered whether he was going to be a goat or a sheep, what will I be?
Yeah. Oh, I love Mr. Rogers. So, slight divergence. Of course, you can't talk about an Italian life without talking about the food. So, what's one of your favorite dishes?
There's so many. Well, I love a part of Italy called Abruzzo, which is on the East Coast on the Adriatic, near the Adriatic Sea, Abruzzo. I'm not, my ancestors were not from there, but I'm Sicilian, Napolitan from Naples, and then I'm from Cassino in the up toward Rome. But I have friends in Abruzzo, and I've come to love Abruzzo. And they have a couple of lovely things. They have this, I'll tell you about one, this cheese that they mix with, it's so simple. It's cheese mixed with egg. And then you fry it. And it's called cacio e uovo, which is cheese, a form of cheese and egg. And they call it a polpette, which means meatball, because it looks like a little meatball, but you fry it. And you could eat it just plain like that, or you could put sauce over it like you put sauce over meatballs. But it is absolutely delicious. It's one of the first things I want to get when I'm over there. And I've learned how to make them here in the States, even though we don't have the same kind of cheese that they use over there. They use that cacio cheese. I found that Parmesan and Romano mixed together work just as well. And you just, mix it with the egg, you roll it into a little meatball, you fry it, delicious.
That sounds really good.
So.
What is one of your proudest moments of your career?
Okay, I can tell you that. Do you want journalism or post-journalism?
How about one from each?
All right. Journalism would be, I wrote a story for the Wall Street Journal. Now, remember this, the Wall Street Journal, about a conservative, religiously conservative business executive caring for his son dying of AIDS. And it was about the reconciliation that he had with his son, that the son had been such a disappointment to him. And then the son contracted AIDS, and the father steps in then to be the primary caretaker of the son while he's dying of AIDS. Well, that generated 200 letters from readers of the Wall Street Journal. It appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And it was a feature story, so it was unusual, for the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And it became a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in the feature writing category. It didn't win that year, but it was a finalist, one of 3 finalists. And the fact that, 200 people took the time to write me after that article appeared, to say things like, I'll never think of a gay person again in the same way. I was like that father. And, now my thinking has changed. And that I really felt like I had provided a service in writing that story. In terms of the books that I write, when people come up to me and they say, your book really opened me up to how I could be living more mindfully and joyfully, that means a lot to me. The fact that anybody would even buy, these books is pure gift, because, people have other things they have to spend their money on. So if they spend $15.95 on my book, I'm deeply honored. And I want to give them something of value. And when they come back to me and say, well, I identified with this, with what you said here, or when I read about this in your book, it changed my perspective. I mean, writers just live for those moments.
That's wonderful. And congratulations on all of your accolades, by the way.
Okay. As I said, that and $2.50 gets me on the local bus.
What is a book that has inspired you? It could have been from childhood, young adult life, whenever.
Yeah. Okay. I can name a few. I was really taken by The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham, which, of course, most people read that. And it's one of the books that people read in college or high school, even, because it's about a guy who goes to France. And see, I studied in France. I studied 1 year in Paris. He goes to Paris because he wants to escape the materialism and the consumerism of the United States. And he wants to see what's of real value in life, what really matters in life. And so I was very taken by Larry Darrell is the name of the character in The Razor's Edge. And then all the books I had a course in college. Father Robert Kennedy, one of the Jesuits who taught me at St. Peter's University, gave a course called Graham Greene, a novelist looks at theology. And I loved Graham Greene novels because all of his characters were kind of messed up, but they were the most compassionate people, in the whole novel, like the whiskey priest, for example, in The Power and the Glory. He's an alcoholic. But he's the one who ends up, kind of giving his life for other people. And all of Graham Greene's main characters, are deeply flawed, but they're also the ones that love the most. And that's what, so I kind of saw myself as a deeply flawed person who still was capable of giving love and giving service. And that's why I like those books very much, and they still touch me to this day.
Wonderful. What is a book that came out recently that you are looking forward to reading?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link.
Oh, I have a lot. Oh my gosh, I have a lot on my bookshelf that I'm reading. In fact, I have the latest book by James Cruz, and the title is The Poet James Cruz. It's escaping me now, but it's a book that he wrote about taking pauses in your life, and all the poems have that kind of a theme to them. And so that's been on my bookshelf waiting for me to finish reading it. Oh gosh, there's just so many. I'm actually rereading The Brothers Karamazov for the second time. I read it in college, and I remembered how much I liked it, and I took it out of the library at least recently because I love. There's monastic characters in it, and they too talk about how they came from. There's Father Zosima is the elder monk in The Brothers Karamazov, and they talk about too how they weathered these sort of down periods in their lives, when they were kind of in a confused state, and how they came to see that, what really matters is how much service we give, how much we love one another. And so I'm actually rereading I'm down to the last 20 or so pages of The Brothers Karamazov.
Excellent. So obviously you've had a very illustrious career. It's still continuing with your several books. But what was a barrier that you're comfortable sharing, internal or external, that you had to jump over and deal with to where you were in your career?
Well, I'm not going to surprise you or many women when I say this, but, you run into men who are bullies. And I've had, male supervisors who were just plain bullies because they were insecure. If they felt that you knew more than they did, or you knew as much as they did, or you were angling for their job, even if you weren't. So you have to get over, how men, just don't always treat you respectfully. They can be dismissive. They can even be unpleasantly sexually aggressive. And so I don't think I'm going to surprise too many women. I don't think there's a woman out there who's been in the professional world that hasn't come up against that, either bullying or disrespect or dismissiveness in a male supervisor. So those were things that, I felt I did have to overcome. But then, there were, for every male editor who was like that, there was one who was just wonderful and, very nurturing and very respectful. So
how has your life in, journalism and, being an author in general been different than what you imagined when you were growing up?
Yeah, I never imagined I would write 8 books, and three poetry collections. I have another poetry collection coming out. I thought I might be a novelist, and that never clicked for me. Writing fiction never clicked for me the way writing poetry did or writing nonfiction did. And so I think when I was that young girl in Paris, walking in the footsteps of Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, going to the same cafes they went to, I thought, well, I might end up being a novelist, but that wasn't to be. I didn't think I would marry as late in life as I did. I always thought, wow, it'd be really great to have a daughter, and I will do everything for my daughter that my parents couldn't do for me. And that wasn't meant to be, because I married later in life. And although I inherited 2 wonderful stepdaughters, I never had that daughter of my own. So I guess those would be a couple of the things.
What is something that always brings you joy?
Well, I love being outdoors, just walking among the trees. Mary Oliver has a poem when she says, "When I am among the trees, they save me and daily." And so I feel that way when I'm among the trees. But also, I love giving retreats. I give a lot of workshops and retreats. And I just love to see, the transformation that happens to people, or when they have that moment of insight that they weren't expecting. I have guided a pilgrimage to Italy the past 2 years in a row, and we're going again this September. It'll be the third year in a row. And I see how this gives me so much joy. People come, they're 12 or 15 strangers to one another. And then by the end of the first 2 days, they become a community. They're no longer a collection of strangers. And the growth that I see in people, we had the first year an 80-year-old woman come with us. And she told me before the trip, "I walk with a cane. This will probably be my last trip that I take, my last trip outside the United States, last big trip." Well, she gets to Italy and she's able to walk farther than she ever thought she could walk. She makes friends among people whose language she doesn't speak, just sign language friendship. She starts eating these foods that she's never tasted. I remember the first time she ate mussels was in Italy, in this seafood restaurant that we all ate in. And she came back to the States. She got into physical therapy. She shed a few pounds. She came back the next year and did even more walking than the first year, and more rigorous walking, much more rigorous walking than the first year. And, this was a woman who thought, my life is over. This is my last trip. I'm 80 years old. Well, she came back the second time. She's coming the third time with us at the age of 82 now. So, those things bring me tremendous joy.
That is so wonderful. That is so wonderful that, people are trying, to find the joy, live the life to the fullest, not letting age or other issues stop them from living a full life, which is, of course, part of your book,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And people in Italy live a long time. Their life expectancy is 83 years. Ours is 78. With all of our money and all of our health care and hospitals, we have a lower life expectancy than the people in Italy. And I think it comes down to two very important points, Tammy, if you'd like me to talk a little briefly about that. One is people walk everywhere, walking. They walk to the store, they walk to church. To see and be seen is a big thing in Italy. For example, the Sunday evening stroll, through the main street. Everybody's kind of strolling on Sunday. So this idea of walking keeps them physically fit, because a lot of people don't have 2-3 cars like we have here. The other thing is this sense of belonging that people have. Families tend to still stay in the same town and stay close by their parents and their grandparents. So there's this sense that you matter to somebody. And golly, when Mother Teresa came to the United States, one of the most profound things she said is that the great American illness is not cancer or heart disease. It is loneliness. And, I see that so often, how lonely young people are, how not, the elderly, yes, the elderly, absolutely. But also young people are very lonely in our country. And so there's this much more sense of a cohesiveness that I see in Italy that I think is so wonderful.
I'd love to talk about mindfulness. Your book obviously, explores concepts of having having a healthier life, having a more joyful life, which of course includes being mindful. So I'm just wondering, what does mindfulness mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's a process, a lifelong learning process. And what is the enemy of mindfulness? The enemy of mindfulness is busyness. When we're really busy, we don't, when we're so intensely involved with what we're doing and our to-do list and our projects that we have to get finished, we don't see the people around us. I know I'm at my crankiest and grouchiest when I'm overworked. And I don't always see my husband's needs in those times, for example, even though we share a life, we live in the same house. He just came by and gave affirmation to what I just said. But yeah, mindfulness is something that we really have to begin to practice. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist monk, talked about, he used to take every third day off completely. He wouldn't have any visitors. He wouldn't do any writing. Every third day off. Now, most of us can't do that. We'd be fired. We can't take every third day off, but we can keep the Sabbath holy. Okay. How many people do you know, Tammy, who work on Sundays? And I'm speaking to myself here. I do writing on Sundays sometimes, but what if we really kept that day, that just one day a week for rest, which is what the Lord says in Genesis. The Lord rests on that day, but we don't. And I actually have often felt that one of the worst decisions ever made or laws put into place was opening the stores, the liquor stores, and the supermarkets and the big box stores on Sundays, because that just gives people another excuse to be busy on a day when they really should be resting. They should be with friends. They should be with family. And believe it or not, Italy has kept up the tradition of closing stores on Sunday afternoon. They're open in the morning, so you can go and get your fresh food that you want to make for your Sunday dinner. You go in the morning, but after 1:00, that's it. The stores are closed.
One last question for you, and I'm wanting to know, how would you like to be remembered? What would you like your legacy to be?
Believe it or not, Tammy, I've thought about this. I thought about, what I'd like on my tombstone. And one of the things that's come to me, lines that's come to me, is she did the best she could with what she had. And I'd like to think that I did the best I could with the gifts that I have, with whatever talent I was given by the Lord, whatever intelligence I was given, that I didn't waste it, that I did the best I could with the gifts that I had.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we sign off?
Yes, go to Italy. Join the fun, join the adventure of going to Italy. And don't just go to Florence or Rome and Venice. Go to the small towns, go to the places like Abruzzo and Molise, places that the tourists don't always see. Sicily, go to the out of the way places.
Excellent. Judith, thank you so much for being on the show. Listeners, please check the show notes for where to buy Judith's latest book, The Italian Soul, How to Savor the Full Joys of Life. It comes out in May of this year, and if you're listening later, it's already out. So please check the show notes for where to purchase her books, and as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Creative Piecemeal. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. This podcast is independently created and produced by the host, Tammy Takaishi. More details about today's guest can be found in the show notes, along with links to the podcast's socials, merch store, and ways to support arts organizations AHA Broadway and New Normal Rep, both near and dear to Tammy's heart. Don't forget to visit creativepiecemeal.com, the official podcast website, where you can leave fan mail, write a review, explore Tammy's blog, and discover the growing collection of episodes. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Alex Rapetti. Additional narration by Dante Jace. Let's keep celebrating creativity in all its forms.